I would like to give the floor to Patrick Utomi. He is the policy consultant at the AfCFTA Bank, and he's going to start by presenting the survey results, as well as some policy recommendations put forward by the PAFTRAC Secretariat.
So good morning. My name is Patrick Utomi, and I am with AfCFTA Bank in the AU and AfCFTA Relations and Trade Policy Department, and I will be taking you through this year's PAFTRAC CEO Trade Survey presentation. Next slide, please. So a little bit about PAFTRAC and about the survey. PAFTRAC is an organization that is supposed to give a platform for the public and private sector to come together and deliberate on policy issues that affect trade across the continent and help guide the formation of these policies at a continental level. The first CEO survey was conducted in 2021 after COVID-19 had taken place. And to date, we've had 3 editions, the last one with over 1,000 responses from CEOs across the continent. We started with just 400 respondents, and now we have sector-specific focus on agriculture, agribusiness, tech, telecoms, banking services, manufacturing, and others. So the survey has grown a lot since its origin. Next slide, please. One thing we noticed about the survey and its respondents was that a majority were SMEs. As you can see from the graphs here, most of the companies have been in operation between 1 and 5 years, making up about 35% of the respondents, and they employ on average 1 to 50 people. So most of these are small businesses, and this speaks to the fact that a majority of businesses operating across Africa are SMEs. About 80% is the accepted statistic. Next slide, please. And now we're going to go into the results of the survey. When we surveyed the companies from various sectors, we found that overwhelmingly, the factor that they considered high impact was the rising inflation. And you can see this in countries such as Nigeria and Egypt that are suffering high rates of inflation. And this is a big impact on businesses, especially those that have to deal in foreign exchange and cross-border trade. Other macroeconomic factors that affected businesses were global security issues, as well as rising debt and high interest rates. These with butterfly effects from the USA, from global conflicts in Ukraine that are spreading and affecting businesses here on the continent. But overwhelmingly, inflation is seen as the one having the most significant impact on the continent and its businesses. Next slide, please. Despite these headwinds, most of the folks that are organizing businesses in Africa are still very positive about the effects of the AfCFTA on their business, with more than 50% thinking that the AfCFTA will have a positive effect. The folks who think it will have a moderate effect are about 24%, and about 18% thought it would have little effect or did not know what effect the AfCFTA would have on their business. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now we move into sector-specific factors. As I mentioned earlier, this survey took into account the agriculture, manufacturing, mining, transportation, logistics, and pharmaceutical sectors across Africa. And the theme that emerged across all of these sectors uniformly almost was access to finance and a lack of it impacting their ability to operate across Africa and scale their businesses. This was overwhelmingly the one factor that was affecting businesses. And it goes to show that if financing does not exist, then anything else you're speaking about in terms of cross-border trade, unification, AfCFTA is nothing more than rhetoric. So you can see on the charts that finance was uniformly indicated as the biggest factor. So you can see the percentages, most 71% in agricultural sector, 61% in manufacturing, 67%. So more than 50% across all sectors. In certain sectors such as mining, you would see things like cost ineffectiveness being a bigger factor, but not so much in other sectors. The same goes for other factors that were noted through the survey, such as policies that were not effective, weak domestic research and innovation, as well as a lack of qualified human capital. but overwhelmingly, finance is the biggest hurdle that these companies have to cross. Next slide, please. So we're going sector by sector now just to give some insights into what each sector identified as the biggest factors. As I said in the previous slide, agriculture noted that financing schemes or lack thereof were their biggest hindrance, followed by a lack of research and domestic innovation. And they also called for a bit more agricultural clusters and special economic zones being established as something that could help them increase their production. Next slide, please. Moving on to transportation and logistics, here again, we see that finance was the biggest stumbling block. 25% of the respondents in that sector said that they can't really scale their businesses without access to finance. The rest of the percentages were spread along industrial policies, human capacity and capital, as well as the development of electronic marketing platforms, because transport and logistics these days have now been heavily impacted by tech, and you see the rise of companies such as Kobo 360 that are making transportation and logistics highly effective across Africa. But in order to plug into these channels, you need to be in the digital markets. Next slide, please. So here we see a bit of a difference in that access to finance is not the biggest factor for banking and financial services, because they are in fact the ones providing financial services. So for banks and for other financial services providers, the biggest factor for them was having a Pan-African open banking system, as well as a single African currency. This would exponentially increase the speed of transactions, as well as cut down on the difficulties in going from one currency to another while engaging in cross-border trade, both for operators as well as for their financial counterparts. Then behind those two factors were having a unified Pan-African capital market strategy, as well as more innovation on the national level and following the legislation that would affect this in Pan-African cloud and data legislation. Next slide, please. So we've come to the end of the summary of what the responses brought out. And following from these responses, PAFTRAC has come up with a few policy recommendations. First of which is that policy focuses on boosting value-added production and exchange within Africa based on our factor endowments, the gifts that Africa is naturally blessed with. And secondly, providing more information and guidance to African business leaders, particularly SMEs, on AfCFTA opportunities. One of the things that came out in each of the last years of the Pan-African Private Sector Survey was that there was a lack of information for SMEs in accessing the AfCFTA. Most of them did not know what the AfCFTA was, what it meant for their businesses, or more importantly, how to tap into it. And if this information is not readily available to them, there is no way for them to participate, because they don't know what awaits them if they do engage in the AfCFTA. And in addition to providing more information and guidance to African business leaders, there needs to be more forums where private sector, particularly the SMEs, can engage with policymakers. You find that most of these forums are accessible to the big businesses across Africa. However, they are hardly attended by the SMEs, who these policies greatly affect. In addition to that, we need to incentivize cross-border aggregators to connect producers and consumers across the continent and increase the regional share of trade. This goes back to the value chain. By creating value chains and promoting policies that incentivize businesses to participate in the value chain, you can then build aggregators in these countries so you can engage in wild-scale trade, similar to companies such as Marubeni globally. And speaking to what I said before, there needs to be more collaboration between the private sector and development institutions to support businesses with credit, training, investment, and trade-friendly policies and regulations. Afreximbank currently does this in partnership with ITC through its How to Export program. Similarly, other institutions need to partner with the private sector to develop capacity improvement for small businesses, which will also inform them as well as capacitate them to participate in the AfCFTA. It's one thing to say that information should be made available, but it's another thing to upskill these businesses, give them the structure so that they can participate in trade. One of the biggest problems to financing trade across Africa is that they don't fit the profile for lending. They have no track record, they have no structures in place, and as such, they are viewed by high risk by financial institutions. By having development finance institutions collaborate with the private sector and develop structures for these companies to learn and structure their own businesses, they in turn are able to access financing because of the structure, creating a virtuous cycle. Lastly, there is a need for more monitoring and evaluation of the AfCFTA implementation and its impact. This again goes back to the need for information and data. We need information on the companies that are participating in the AfCFTA, the challenges that they are facing, and how the private sector and public sector can come together to help address these challenges. This is also why PAFTRAC is engaging in this annual survey. By listening to the SMEs across the continent, we can then collect data on their challenges, how far they are along in accessing the AfCFTA, and how best the DFIs as well as the regulators can help them address their challenges and hopefully lead to a more prosperous future of trade across the continent for these companies and for all of us. With that, I believe I have come to the end of this presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I will take any question from our moderator.
Thank you very much indeed, and congratulations once again on the survey and all the work that you guys have put together. Only one question before we go into our panel discussion. One thing that struck me was over the last 3 years, the low awareness, the low access to information that a lot of the SMEs and the CEOs have in relation to the AfCFTA. Now, as PAFTRAC and as partners and stakeholders that work with PAFTRAC, what can we do in order to tackle this issue? What are your thoughts on it, Patrick?
Thank you very much for that question, Pedro. And that's a very important question because, as we've said before, without information, no one can access the AfCFTA or its benefits. What we found out many things. We found out that there needs to be a push from the public sector as well as development finance institutions in getting this information out, but more importantly, through the channels where these SMEs are located. The AfCFTA has done very well. They released an e-tariff book, so the information is out there. However, there is a low level of access. This is because this information is not being given to the folks who are participating in trade where they are. So it's easy to put the information out there on the website, but if no groundwork is being done, if there are no people on the ground where these people are trading saying, hi, this information is available to you, you often see that people participating in cross-border trade meet most of their issues and do most of their learning at the borders. They have to figure out the language issues. They need to figure out what the policies are. And this also leads to them getting exploited by sometimes border officials because they don't know any better. So we need to put this information on ground, on those places, at those border points where people are going to participate in trade so that they know, number one, their rights, number two, what they can do, what they can't do, and that would greatly facilitate their ability to participate in cross-border trade. So there are many lessons. There are some on the public-facing end, the policies that the regulators need to put in place. There's a lot that the DFIs can do in capacity and upskilling, but all in all, we need to meet the people who are participating in trade where they are.
Very, very good, Patrick. So I'm sure that the PAFTRAC as an organization will also have a role to play here, I'm sure. And thank you very much again for the policy recommendations. I mean, you said 5 or 6 that are very important. Is PAFTRAC and the AfCFTA and others prioritizing 1 or 2, or are you going to hopefully push all this together over the course of the next year? What is your policy implementation strategy on this regard?
As a policy guidance organization, PAFTRAC will heavily be focusing on getting the words of the private sector heard by the public sector. So information is going to be a big thing. By collecting this data from the SMEs and giving them a voice, and also by communing with the bigger DFIs, the regulators, and saying, okay, now that we have this information, where can we go to make it more available to the people? So spreading the word and getting the information out, combating this information asymmetry will be one of the biggest tasks for PAFTRAC and for the backers, AfCFTA.
Very, very good. And is very timely as well, because we just had a very successful IATF in Cairo. So once again, congratulations on the great work. Yeah, we really hope that the 4th edition is going to be even better. So Patrick, again, thank you very much.